There we go. Okay. Can you see that? Perfect. Okay. And as Mohammed mentioned, like throughout, if you have any questions, then do please put them in the chat or, put your hand up and feel free to kind of prompt the team and I'll try and answer them as we go along. But any that are tricky, I might save till the end, give me a bit more time to think. So it was a year that Facebook had just launched and I was sort of 3 years into my career and I'd been given a new assignment as a business analyst. I was to pair up with a lady called Natalie, and she was a mature student, and she was doing a summer internship at the company I was working at, which was BT. And she came from a sales background, and I was a software developer. And so the company felt it would be a good thing to do to pair us up and really relabel us as business analysts. And our job was to go out and elicit some requirements from a really tricky stakeholder whose name was Malcolm. And the problem was everybody was scared of Malcolm. He was one of these people who, if he didn't agree with something, he wouldn't be shy to voice his concerns. And the project manager at the time, the IT project manager, had fallen out with Malcolm. The night before, the project team had worked throughout the night to prepare a presentation for Malcolm. And within about 5 minutes of them presenting the next morning, Malcolm walked out of the room. And he complained that the team just weren't listening to him. And this kind of made me very afraid. However, Natalie wasn't scared at all. She actually relished the challenge of seeing if we could bring Malcolm to our way of thinking and connect with us in a new way. Now, to cut a long story short, Natalie and I spent a lot of time with Malcolm, and we did win him over. But what I realized was it wasn't because of all of my technical knowledge and my software skills. It was because Natalie was able to connect with him at a human level. And it really showed me this power of connection. Now, just some of the ways she did this were, for example, the very first meeting we had with Malcolm, she saw that I was sitting opposite him in the room, and this is when we were doing a lot of face-to-face interaction. And she asked me to change my position and actually sit next to Malcolm so that we avoid this them and us approach. After every meeting, she would phone him up. That's when we had the traditional telephones. And she would call him up and just ask a general question. How did that go for you, Malcolm? Is there anything we could do differently for next time? And it was amazing what impact that had, because Malcolm really felt like we cared, and we did. We genuinely cared. And he became a completely different person. So in this session, I'm going to explore this topic a little bit further around the power of human connection and how to have those valuable conversations at work. Now, I won't bore you with my career history because Mohammed did a great job of telling you a little bit about my background. But way back, I often say to people, I used to be a professional introvert. I was probably the last person to ever put up my hand in class. I certainly couldn't present in front of people. And over the years, something changed and switched. And now I often tell people I'm addicted to conversation, because if you ever meet me, maybe in the street, I'll be the annoying guy that just doesn't stop yapping, and I'll be super interested in to know about you and finding out about the things that you're passionate about. My wife hates it, especially when we're on holiday. If I ever go to the bar, I won't return for at least half an hour, and that's never a good thing when you're on holiday with your wife. And I grew up in a town called Warwick. Now, I know Imran's from Rugby, which isn't too far actually. And I sometimes compare Warwick to the movie. Oh, I often compare it to Harry Potter, because there's a big castle in Warwick and it's this picturesque town. It's such a beautiful little town. And when I was about 11, my family decided to move to what I call Jurassic Park. which is Birmingham. No offense to people from Birmingham. I don't live too far away from Birmingham. But the school that I went to, oh, I think Kevin's, there we go. He's on mute now. So I went to a school in Birmingham, which was really probably one of the roughest schools in the area. And it's a place where only the fittest survive. And so I came from a really crazy background, I would say. The school itself, when I left, was the worst performing high school in the UK. And that's official because that's when the league tables had just come out and we were bottom. And as I was growing up, my parents would tell me, as good parents do, don't talk to strangers. And I'm an only child as well. So I never really had that many people around me as I was growing up. And so as a result, I think that introversion really excelled because I'd really struggle to make conversation with people. And so this notion of connection in today's age has become super powerful. So if we look at the different economic eras and relate that to connection. So during the 18th century, we had the industrial economy. And this is where we had big cities that were sort of built up with factories, and people started flocking to those big cities. And we started to have this sort of interconnected society. And then obviously in the 20th century, we had the information economy that many of us have been part of. And we then started to connect in new and completely different ways through the digital connections, which were made possible by the internet. And in today's world, Seth Godin, who's a marketing thought leader, he talks about how we're now living in the connection economy. And the connection economy is really where we're leveraging our networks, just as we are today here, through the meetup and the community, through things like LinkedIn. And we're able to gain a competitive advantage, not just personally, but professionally as well. I can recall a number of people that say to me they've never applied for a job in the last few years because they'll often connect with somebody, and just through those connections, they're often encouraged to join different companies. And so this network and this connection is super, super powerful. And you've probably heard the old saying as well. It's not what you know, it's who you know. Now, if we look at the tube map, the most valuable stations are usually those that have the most lines going across them. It's the stations that are typically better connected than any other station. And if we look to some of the big tech brands out there, I call these the super connectors because they've built their entire business model on connection. As we know, Airbnb relies entirely on connecting travelers with accommodation. Uber connect drivers to passengers. And as I mentioned, LinkedIn, we are connecting in completely new ways. And none of these companies really sell a physical product. What they're selling is connection. Now, here's a question for you guys. What might be holding you back from speaking to a stakeholder? Now, it might be that you're able to speak to everybody, but if anybody ever has that challenge, I'd love to see in the chat or come off mute and let me know, what are some of those challenges that you face?
I'll say fear of being judged.
Oh, wow. Yes. In what way, Mohammed?
Maybe I'll say something that totally makes no sense to this particular stakeholder that I'm perceiving who is a little bit higher in the ranks than I am, and make a total fool of myself.
Nice. Yes, absolutely. Especially that hierarchy. We sometimes find those senior people, they're a bit sort of overwhelming at times. James says being heard but not listened to. Nice. Richard?
I think fear that I don't understand the full picture and the stakeholder knows more than me, and my opinions would be dismissed.
Yeah, because they're experts, allegedly, in their specialism. So it's often, again, overwhelming. I used to work for IBM and I was working at JLR, and I met a stakeholder who knew so much about cars. It felt overwhelming because I just couldn't have a conversation with them. They spoke with so much jargon that it really sort of put me in my shell. Let's see what Dave says. Dave says, organizational politics. Yes. Politics is always a difficult one to navigate. And Shrivastava, they have not created a safe space for me to open up. Yeah, that psychological safety. Being able to have that psychological safety is really important. And I promise I didn't pay you for this next slide because you've given me a nice segue into my next slide. So imagine if I said to one of you on the call right now, I want you to come off mute and I want you to present this slide to everybody on the call. Now, I'm pretty sure there's an element of fear that probably would run through that mind of yours. And it's really interesting because when we break down the process of being uncomfortable, it's actually quite a sophisticated process, but it happens in an instant. So being an ex-BA, I thought I'd draw a little process diagram. So what happens first is our brain starts to categorize a situation as being uncomfortable. It could be potentially threatening. And this could be based on past experiences because we may have been put in an uncomfortable situation in the past. It could be based on cultural norms or just personal insecurities. Now, I'm not an expert on brain science, but I think what I've done here, I've just taken some of the high level aspects. And so the amygdala, which is a part of the brain which is responsible for sort of processing emotions, it starts to go into threat detection mode. And there's a sort of a mental alarm system that goes off that starts to flag potential danger here. Then the amygdala starts to release certain hormones, certain stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. Now, sometimes adrenaline is good, but in this situation, it starts to cause us some panic. Now, the best way I can explain this is if you've ever watched a horror movie and you see that build up and then all of a sudden you have that fright, it's that sort of feeling where your brain is literally shocked and you're not quite sure what to do. And then next, the brain sort of engages the prefrontal cortex. Now, this is a good part of the brain because it's responsible for decision making and planning what you're going to do next. And it starts to assess the situation and starts to consider some of the potential outcomes, a bit like a cost benefit analysis. And then we have a decision to make. The brain's searching for past experiences, coping strategies. And if we had positive experiences of this sort of situation before, well, then perhaps we continue and we ride it out. Otherwise, if we're feeling too much discomfort, we might just decide to avoid the situation completely. So the brain is making all these decisions, but it's happening in an instant. Now, the good news is, as we go through these uncomfortable experiences, each time the brain learns and we're able to, in terms of the next time we face a similar situation, we're able to recall those experiences. And each time we're giving ourselves a little nudge. And over time, the brain starts to feel more comfortable. No wonder people who do public speaking, when they tell you their story of the first time they did it, they were terrified. And maybe over multiple years, they feel a lot more comfortable and confident. And that's because they've slowly nudged themselves over that time period. And it's the same with speaking to stakeholders. I remember the first time I spoke to Malcolm, I was petrified. But then over the years, I actually relish speaking to stakeholders now because I'm always interested in knowing about what they've got to say. Now, I mentioned there was a bit of a switch in terms of myself over those years. And I think one contributing factor might be the podcast episodes that I do. I've been running the podcast for about 2 years, and I literally speak to a stranger every week. Most of my guests I've never met before. I've never even talked to them. And so I have this 1 hour to start to build rapport with them, have a meaningful conversation, but also build a connection. And I think having those experiences has really taught me a huge amount about connection. And I'll try and share a few of those now. So it's really about building this fearless mindset. And I love this word mindset because it implies that the mind is set when actually it isn't really. As we've seen, the brain can learn and start to feel more comfortable. Some of you may have heard about the boiling frog analogy. So the boiling frog analogy is whereby if we had a pot of boiling water and we put a frog in there, it'd probably jump straight back out. However, if we had a cold pot of water and we put the frog in there, this is a theory anyway, I don't know if it's true, but as we heat up the water, the frog stays in there because it gradually sneaks up on them. And they say they will probably end up dying in the end because they don't jump out. Who knows? But it's a similar sort of analogy to when we're making conversations. What we don't want to do is jump too far. And I think especially when we're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, we probably don't want to jump, make that huge leap. And I love this video because it just shows the power of taking small steps. So in 1983, a guy called Lorne Whitehead wrote in the American Journal for Physics, and he discovered that a single domino is capable of bringing down another domino that's actually 50% larger. So in this video, there's 20 dominoes. If we had 29, the last one would be as high as the Empire State Building. So just by taking those small steps can really build up. And so this process of getting uncomfortable is something that I think we can cheat. There's a great TED Talk. I don't know if anyone's watched this TED Talk, but it's from a guy called Jie Zhang. And he sets himself a challenge to face rejection for 100 days consecutively. And he does all sorts of crazy things. Like he'll turn up to a complete stranger's house with a plant in his hand, and he'll ask if he can plant the plant in the front garden of this complete stranger. And I won't spoil it for you because it's worth a watch. But what he found was each time he faced rejection, he would learn from that rejection. And it helped him change his approach the next time, or at least adapt his approach slightly so that each time he had slightly more success. And again, he took lots of small steps. The other thing I've learned is getting used to rejection. So again, on the podcast, I often reach out. It's like a cold call going out to a complete stranger. And here's an email I sent to actually somebody that I really wanted as a guest. This person is super famous in the product management space. And I thought I'd just reach out, send them a polite email and see what they say. Well, it was a flat no, but at least they gave me a reason. And it was because they just had too much on their plate at that time. Now, when I used to get these sort of emails initially, I was kind of disheartened, and I'd often find myself reflecting and feeling a bit deflated. But over time, you get to understand why people say no. And it's often because time is a problem. They've got too many other commitments, or I do have certain examples where people say no because I'm just not famous enough for them. And that's fine, but at least I know. But it doesn't deter me. So now I'll literally reach out to as many people as I can. And many of them do reject me, but I try not to get disheartened. And I think that uncomfortable process has really helped to kind of overcome some of that. Now, I know Mohammed was talking originally about sort of feeling this overwhelm such that this other person might be more senior than you, and you don't want to sort of, I guess, make a fool of yourself in front of somebody. So there's this kind of personal doubt that creeps in. And it's really interesting, our self-talk and the language that we use, it's often this language of, I don't want to make a mistake. But actually, when we think of other professions like actors, whenever they make a mistake, they don't call it a mistake. they call it a missed take. And it's usually, an opportunity to do a retake so that they can do an even better job. And in fact, I think they become better actors as a result. So really reframing our language can unlock, I believe, a lot of opportunity and this sort of fear that we have. One of the things that I've definitely learned during my podcasting is getting comfortable with your own voice. Now, I've spoken to actors, singers, people who use their voice as part of their day-to-day careers. And one thing they always say to me is, we always cringe at the sound of our own voice, or we always cringe at watching ourselves back on video. And I always find that fascinating. And it's just human nature. I think we all face this. And again, I've edited myself in my headphones for over 150 episodes now. And I have to say, I'm starting to become slightly more comfortable with my own voice. And that's not to say it in a arrogant way, but I think there comes a time when you just think, well, that's the way I sound. And that's just the way it is. So it's really, again, that self-reflection and constantly challenging yourself in different ways so that you start to become more comfortable with yourself. I'm wondering, Mohammed, if it's worth going to the chat for a question or two before I sort of waffle on.
We can do, but there aren't any questions.
Oh, okay. Just some thoughts. Okay, I got it.
So maybe an opportunity for anybody who wants to take a pause and have a quick question or thought to share, maybe.
There is a question by Dave. Dave, if you want to unmute yourself. Dave Green.
Yes.
Yeah, so really my question was, there's probably something about being in the right mental state to actually learn from the rejection rather than perhaps being just getting caught up in being rejected. So I wondered if there were any tips you might have in terms of how not to take that rejection personally when reaching out to a stakeholder for the first time, maybe starting that relationship.
Yeah, oh, that's a great question, Dave. And I think, I don't have a magic formula, but I think the more we do it and the more we sort of take those small steps, I think the better. So, for example, if I had never done any public speaking and I'm a massive introvert and I decide, right, I'm going to set myself a goal next month, I'm going to present at a big agile conference. That's probably going to be a step too far. And I'm probably setting myself up for failure. And so it's really challenging yourself, but in small ways. And I think I was going to do this as a challenge, which was going to be a 30-day conversational challenge. And I was going to set myself this challenge. I want to do it at some point, but I'd love to just speak to complete random strangers for 30 days consistently. But each time make the conversation a little bit more challenging for myself. So the first step could be just going and buying a coffee and just having a very friendly conversation with the barista on the other side, asking them how was their day. And then slowly over time, you get braver and braver. And so you get to a point where you could probably ask a complete stranger something pretty ambitious. I don't know, maybe ask them if they'd like to go to a movie or something. Now I'm talking if you're single. I probably wouldn't do that because that's not the right thing to do. But each time you could challenge yourself a little bit more and become a little bit braver. And I think that self-talk then over time also changes because it starts to say things like, well, that last time didn't go too bad. So maybe this time, it's going to be okay. So just nudging yourself a little bit, I think really helps. And surrounding yourself with positive people. I think that's the other thing that's really helped me as well is when you're in that environment where people are supportive, I think it just gives you that little bit of confidence as well. So that's probably the other key factor.
Paddy, maybe I can add one thing to that.
Yeah, go for it.
Just a thought. One of the tips that I've come to learn over the number of years is just staying curious. So let's say I was rejected on something or somebody said no to me for whatever it is. I might just be like, I'm curious why they said no. Just doing I'm curious why they said no. I don't even have to go and ask them why.
Mhm.
but it changes the mindset from rejection to curiosity. You don't have to have that question answered, but quite often than not, it could be that the timing wasn't right, or what you're offering wasn't right, or the way you offered it wasn't right. But it gives you room to explore without taking it personally, just curiosity.
Yeah, curiosity is a great superpower, I think, as well. When I used to sort of run business analysis teams, I used to tell my business analysts, like, you have a golden ticket, a bit like Willy Wonka's golden ticket, right? You can talk to anyone in the organization. And a great way to start the conversation is to say, hey, I'm a business analyst and I have to understand how the business works. Could you tell me what you do? And there's very little chance of the other person saying no to that because you've told them the reason. And the fact is, most of us do like to talk about ourselves. So it's a great way to get other people to open up. And I think as soon as you do get curious and you start to ask people about themselves, we're usually quite forthcoming, unless they don't have time. And that's obviously a separate issue. But no, really good conversation in the chat as well. So thank you, folks. Keep that coming. Okay, so one of the other things that can help is having that sort of elevator pitch. So when we're talking to a complete stranger and they ask you that dreaded question, so what do you do? It's always good to have a really sort of polished view of what you do rather than just saying I'm an agile coach, because the other person may not even know what one of those is. And so here's just a simple template that a guy called Matt Abrahams, who is a host of one of the probably most popular podcasts on communication, called Think Fast, Talk Smart. And Matt's one of the people I had on my podcast. This guy is a Stanford lecturer. He's a celebrity almost in the communication world. And I was completely shocked when he said yes, and he agreed to spend an hour with me. But he uses this template to say, if you sort of write this down and work it through for yourself, then you can always change the language afterwards. But it's really saying, what if you could? So you're giving people the opportunity, or you're telling people the opportunity here, so that, and then there's a benefit. For example, and then we give an example of the value, and that's not all. Now, it sounds a bit cryptic, but let me give you an example. So when people ask me, for example, what's your podcast about? Like, why should I listen to you? So using this template, what if you could invest just 30 minutes a week to listen to conversations with experts about human skills in tech, so that you can diversify your learning and get inspired? For example, you could learn how to become a confident speaker, be more creative, and be more productive. By the way, that's not all. You could sign up for a weekly newsletter so that you get notified of new episodes. Now, I know that sounds quite sort of robotic, but I think the important thing is just the thought process of thinking that through. So if you're offering a service, for example, you might be self-employed, or you're selling your service within a work environment. It's always good to really know what value we're bringing to the table and how the other person can benefit from that. So it's just one of the templates that I quite like. I think the other thing that's really helped me is diversifying the group of people you talk to. So typically on a day-to-day basis, I talk to like-minded people, agile people. I talk to a lot of clients who are going through similar problems and they're finding it a struggle, going through an agile transformation, for example. But the podcast has really helped me because I speak to some very diverse individuals. And here's just an example and a snapshot of some of the people I talk to. Everybody from the founder of Comedy Central, which was a channel. He talked to me all about comedy and how comedy can be a superpower, how it can help you. A psychic medium, this is a field that I had no idea about. But again, really understanding that person's mindset gave me a whole new perspective on what she does. I've spoken to a monk as well, who is now an agile coach. That was quite cool. But as you can see, there's such a diverse group of people here. And I have to say, it's a great conversation starter. For example, if I'm out and about, I'm at the pub with friends, I'll talk about one of these stories. For example, the NASA engineer that I had on, he talked about how he designed the most complicated toilet in the world for one of the space shuttles. Now that's a great conversation starter because people just want to lean into that. They want to know, how was it? What was it? So I think having a diverse group of people around you can really accelerate your storytelling and your ability to hold those conversations. Now, again, as an introvert, I often am looking at little hacks of how I can start conversation in a relatively easy way. So I thought I'd create a little what could you call it? Not a framework, but just a little guide. So I guess the more confident we become, the more further up we get on this kind of barometer on the screen. So to start with, you could start off with something as simple as having something quite interesting in your email signature. Now, in my email signature at work, I have my favorite quote, which was from Gandhi. And the quote is something like, "The best way to lose yourself is in the service of others." And I love that quote because I think it epitomizes a lot of what I try and do and what I try and live up to. And I can't tell you the amount of times I've had people reply just to a completely different email that I've sent them. And they've replied and said, "Oh, I love your email signature," or they've commented on it. And it's a great conversation starter. And that's without me even speaking to someone or trying. I've tried this experiment where I've tried to put some quirky backgrounds as my virtual background. And again, the number of times people will comment on your background on a Zoom call or a Teams call is phenomenal. It could be as simple as having, I don't know, an astronaut behind you, or space, or something that you're passionate about. And it's a great way for the other person to sort of lean in and start to make a comment about what they're seeing. The smile test. So sometimes when I go jogging, I challenge myself to smile at as many people as I can. And they always say that if you smile at somebody, 9 times out of 10, they're going to smile back. So that's the smile test. And I'm a bit geeky this way. I sort of tot up a tally in my head thinking, right, if I smile at 10 people, how many smiles do I get back? And it's a great little challenge, especially when you're bored. So try the smile test, and that's without saying a word as well. If you're getting a bit braver, try wearing some quirky clothing. So I don't have it here right now, but I have this LED badge, which I got off Amazon, and I wear it to conferences now. It's become a signature thing. And it has this scrolling message that you can program to anything you want. And it absolutely works. So I was at a business analysis conference in September, and the amount of people that as they walk past, their heads turn and they just start following the scroll. And it's a great opportunity to then strike a conversation with people. So if you're at a networking event, at a conference, it could be as simple as a quirky t-shirt that has a message on there, or you could even get one of those LED badges. But I think having some kind of social object that encourages conversation is another really great way. And then there's small talk. So those times when we're standing around either in the lift, at work, or we're at the water cooler, and other people come along, how do you strike a conversation with people? Well, again, I love this very simple saying, which is be interested and not interesting. And this is something I got off Matt Abrahams's podcast. He had a guest on there that used this quote. And I love this because, again, going back to Mohammed's point, being curious about the other person is going to give you so much more than, say, if I just stand there and talk about myself. And there's a lady called Rachel Greenwald, who's a dating coach, and she gives some really good tips for small talk. So she says, don't be a data collector. And what she means by this is try not to ask the obvious questions like, what do you do? Don't be predictable. Try to be curious and try and encourage the person to really sort of lean in. So, if somebody says to you, well, what do you do? rather than me saying I'm an agile coach, I might give them a bit of a cryptic answer, which creates that curiosity. So I might say, I'm addicted to conversation. I love to play with Lego and I doodle for a living. Now, hopefully that makes that conversation a little bit more interesting, because now the other person's thinking, I have no idea what you do, but let me find out. And we start that engagement. And look, if you can't think of anything interesting to ask the other person, then maybe don't ask anything at all and just make an observation about your surroundings. And invite stories. So when we're asking somebody about themselves, we might ask them, well, can you tell me about a time when you did X, Y, Z? Or when did you realize you had this passion with Lego? And so again, it invites that person to almost start to go into story mode, because when we ask them for, tell me about a time, it encourages storytelling. And I love this one. So the white flag technique, if anyone's into their car racing, I'm not, but I've certainly watched some of those F1 races on TV. They often have the white flag, not the checkered flag, but there's a white flag that they wave just before the last lap. And it's almost a signal to say, right, you're about to finish the race now. Well, Rachel Greenwald, she talks about using the white flag technique for when you're signaling to the other person that you're ready to finish the conversation. Because in a networking event, it's all too easy to get sort of stuck in a conversation that you can't get out of. And so again, you can use a white flag to end the conversation, to say, hey, I've just noticed I've only got 5 more minutes. So it's a signal to the other person that, look, I love what I'm hearing, but I am going to have to go in a moment. And so again, it just ends the conversation on a positive, rather than all of a sudden saying, right, sorry, I've got to go. So that's something else that I particularly love. There's a great book by a lady called Sam Horn. It's called Tung Fu. And I love that name because it's a book that gives you lots of tips about how you can change your communication style to really make more engaging conversation. And so Sam talks about just some words that we should lose and words that we should use. And so here's just some examples. So instead of sort of using the word but, so we might say, yes, but. She says, acknowledge the other person's idea and use yes and. So it's a nice way to sort of make the person feel that you've listened and what they've said is positive. I won't go through all of these, but I will share the slides so you have access to these. But there's just some simple tweaks we can make in our language to make the conversation more positive. And then the other person feels so much better too. Again, don't know who said this, but I love this as well. Silence is a sound of thinking. So often in a conversation, there's this urge to speak and to jump in. But actually, if you be silent, we're thinking, we're making connections, we're building connections, and it gives the other person that time and the space as well to be able to express some of their ideas. Now, traditionally at work, it was difficult for us to capture things that go on in workshops, in meetings. And so our listening skills were being really tested, because whilst we're trying to soak up all of the information and the context and the meaning of what our stakeholders are saying, we were often focused so much on writing things down. And thanks to AI, and this is one of the positives of AI, I think, we have apps now that can help us with that. And so I sometimes use AI for my podcast to summarize the conversation. So I don't have to worry too much about capturing key points, or even in a meeting, trying to capture all the actions, etc. We can use some really cool tools now that help us with this. So this one is the read.ai, but it's just one of many. And I know Zoom now has some of this built into it as well. So a tip for if you're running meetings with stakeholders, then use some of these tools, provided they're compliant with your company policy, because they can summarize key actions just from some of the words we're using in the meeting. So as soon as we mention the word, oh, I think we should maybe take this away as an action, it will take note of that as being an action. So again, and you can summarize the conversation for people that weren't there so that they can easily catch up as well. There you go. Liat says Otter AI as well. Yes, that's a really good one as well. And if some of us are agile coaches, you may have come across Socratic questioning, which is just a technique from the Greek philosopher Socrates. Sometimes as we want to probe further with the conversation, I find some of these questions are super, super useful. So if we're trying to clarify things, we could use some of these orange questions here. If we want to probe their rationale, we can really sort of go deeper with some of these questions. So again, I won't go into these in any more detail, but there are lots of great questions we could be asking. And it's really building up that bank of questions so that when you're in that situation, you can apply the appropriate sort of approach. Okay, so question to the audience, and feel free to come off mute for this one. If I asked you, what could you do with a Frisbee? So what are some creative things you could do with a Frisbee? What would you say?
We turn it around and use it as a plate to eat my food.
Oh, nice. Yes, use it as a plate. I've got a plate here. So yeah, it's kind of like the same sort of shape. Anything else?
To make a nice,
Oh, I missed that. Sorry, Richard.
it would make a nice hat.
A nice hat. Yes, absolutely. I won't do that with the plate, but yes, absolutely.
Well, I can play with the Frisbee, what it is meant to do. So I can
Oh,
play.
okay. So just use it as it's meant to be used. Okay, there we go.
Right, and since I would never use it for fun or anything, I'll try to sell it.
Sell it. Oh, there we go, James. James is
I'm
the
a,
entrepreneur.
I'm a minimalist, so I don't like to have many things at home. And if somebody gives me a thing, I try to get rid of it.
Got it.
Paddy, as a facilitator or an agile coach, I would love to see what happens when you need to use it as a mic and permission to speak in a big audience.
Oh, nice. So it's almost like the signal to say whoever catches a Frisbee is now able to talk, right? As an object.
Or if you're speaking, someone needs to hand it over so you can see that you cut them off.
Right.
Facial tool.
Love that. Well,
Paddy, you could also throw it to Malcolm, the stakeholder that.
yes, absolutely. Yeah, hopefully he catches it.
As a weapon, yeah.
I want to say, don't use it as dart.
Not as a dart. So two professors from Stanford and Columbia University recently published a study, and they wanted to compare the level of creativity with both face-to-face groups and virtual groups. Now, they gave 600 volunteers 5 minutes to come up with as many ideas as they could on how you could use a Frisbee. And then they gave them 1 minute to come up with their best idea. It's kind of interesting. So what they found was face-to-face groups generated on average 20% more ideas than their virtual counterparts. And so the conclusion from that study was when we're face-to-face, we're able to build many more ideas. Now, I know Mohammed said you could use it as a plate, and that's definitely a common use that many people said. Now, they had some independent judges that judged which ideas were more creative than others. So what they deemed that the plate idea is great, but it's perhaps not as creative as, for example, and don't ask me if this is even possible because I don't think it is, but using a Frisbee to slice fruit. Okay, so that in terms of a creativity test is what was deemed as a slightly more creative idea. Now, there was another study that was done with over 1,500 engineers, and they found similar results. So what they also found was the ideas that were generated by those face-to-face groups, not only did they generate more ideas, 20% more, but their preferred idea was generally more creative than the virtual people. And there are probably lots of reasons for that. I won't go into that right now, but it just goes to show the power of connection, because when we're able to connect in a room together, face to face, it just becomes super powerful. That's not to say we should do everything face to face, because if you want to scale up your ideas, then obviously virtual is the way to go, because we can get many more people on a call. But individually, we tend to generate more ideas when we're in person. Now, finishing up, there's a great study from Harvard, and it's the longest running longitudinal study in history. It's been running for over 100 years. And this Harvard study, they were trying to answer the question of, what is the one thing that determines that you'll be healthier, happier, and more successful later on in life? Like, what is that one factor? And so they took a population of Harvard graduates way back in the 20s, and these graduates committed to filling out a questionnaire every 2 years to be part of this study. And then when they had children and grandchildren, they've continued this study, and now they have a few hundred of these people who are part of this study. And what they found, and it's called the study of adult development. Now, what they found was the number one factor that helps us live longer, be happier, be more successful is the people that have the most meaningful connections between the ages of 45 to 50 tend to go on to the age of around 80 to be more successful and happier too. And so the study is fascinating because it really explores this notion of connection and building meaningful connections. So if you are between that age range, get rid of those Facebook friends and start building meaningful connections. And I certainly have to do that. So the power of connection is absolutely huge. Now, if all else fails in everything I've said, then buy yourself a cute dog, because I'm going to tell you, this is the secret of connection. We've had our little puppy for just over a year, little Milo. And I'm telling you, every day I take him for a walk, I meet new people, and so many more people talk to me now than they ever did in the park. And he even got us on TV as well. So this was an interview on a local channel. They saw us with the dog and they did an interview. And so because of him, I'm semi-famous, I think. Anyway, that's what I like to think. And so on that note, I'm going to finish up there. What I would say, if you are interested in connecting with me, then please do link in with me. That's probably my preferred social media channel. So just type in Paddy Dhanda or Paddy Dhanda, which is my sort of proper name. And also, if you're interested in the podcast, then feel free to scan this code and you'll get to the podcast. But yeah, on that note, Mohammed, I'll open up for questions and I'll take a little pause.
Thank you.